Well, in the coming hours, negotiators from the US and China will sit face to face. Their job, lay the groundwork for a deal that will end the trade war between the world's two largest economies. China has already made some concessions, and US President Donald Trump says he's got leverage. Anna Stewart has the details.
Trade talks restart Monday between China and the United States, with deputy trade ministers meeting in Beijing for 2 days. Now, this will be the first formal negotiations we've had since President Trump and President Xi agreed to a truce last month. Now, investors will be watching developments from this very, very carefully. And I would say, depending on the outcome of the talks, we could see further market volatility. Also watching developments there will be tech CEOs, but they will be watching from Las Vegas. Monday is the start of the week, but it's also the start of CES, the annual world's biggest tech show. And we will be sending our very own Samuel Burke. He's going to have some interviews with top CEOs, as well as bringing us all the latest gizmos, gadgets, and latest trends. And on Wednesday, we may see former Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn. Now, he hasn't actually been seen in public since November 19th, when he was arrested in Tokyo. He's accused of financial wrongdoing. Now, on Wednesday, we're told by the Tokyo District Court he will make an appearance at a hearing he himself has requested to seek an explanation as to why he's been held for so long. He will also have an opportunity to make a statement at this hearing, so that is certainly one to watch. Carlos Ghosn has maintained his innocence throughout this ordeal, according to his Tokyo-based lawyer. For now, back to you.
Thanks for that. Well, the British Parliament is set to begin debating Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit deal with the EU this week. Despite reports saying she might delay the vote a second time, Mrs May says it will take place as planned in mid-January. Many lawmakers worry the deal would leave Britain too beholden to the EU. But the Prime Minister warned that if they reject the plan, the UK will be in uncharted territory. She also reiterated that a second Brexit referendum is out of the question. And at royal houses, US President Donald Trump says he might declare a national emergency to secure military funding for his border wall. The Vice President met with congressional leaders Sunday, but they couldn't reach a budget agreement. The dispute has led to a partial government shutdown now in its third week. US politicians from both sides of the aisle took to the airwaves on Sunday. They spoke about whether the president actually has the authority to secure military funding for his border wall, and they debated the merits of such an action.
Presidents have authority to defend the nation. The president has asked every single cabinet secretary and the Office of Management and Budget to go out and find money that can be used legally to guard the southern border, which is exactly what we're going to do.
Does President Trump have the ability, have the authority to declare a national emergency, have the military build his wall?
Well, unfortunately, the short answer is yes. There is a provision in law that says the president can declare an emergency. It's been done a number of times, but primarily it's been done to build facilities in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in this case, I think the president would be wide open to a court challenge saying, where's the emergency? You have to establish that in order to do this. But beyond that, this would be a terrible use of Department of Defense dollars.
So let's take a closer look at all of this with CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Leighton. Always great to have you with us.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's good to be with you.
So we just heard from both sides of the political equation, the Democrats suggesting the president does not have the power to declare a national emergency to secure military funds to build his border wall, while the White House and Republicans say he can do whatever he needs to do to secure this nation. So
border wall could be had. The president, meantime, has continued suggesting a drastic option. He has said that he is seriously considering declaring a national emergency to get the funds necessary to build his border wall. I asked the president about that on Sunday as he returned from a retreat at Camp David. Listen to his justification.
We're looking at a national emergency because we have a national emergency. Just read the papers. We have a crisis at the border of drugs, of human beings being trafficked all over the world. They're coming through. And we have an absolute crisis, and of criminals and gang members coming through. It is national security. It's a national emergency.
I followed up in asking President Trump if he had a specific deadline or something specific that he would have to see during these talks to then trigger his announcement of a national emergency, his declaration. He didn't answer. He said we'd have to wait and see. We'll tell you soon. The president also made a statement that made waves, suggesting that he had given up on the idea of a concrete barrier between the United States and Mexico, saying that now it'll be a steel barrier between the two nations, suggesting that Democrats don't like concrete. Boris Sanchez, CNN at the White House.
Well, the shutdown is taking a toll on many Americans. Government employees and vendors aren't getting paid, and people who rely on government services could be facing delays. Here's a look at some of the impact. Funding for food assistance programs is running low. Some airport security workers are calling out sick. The nation's tax collection agency, the IRS, might not be able to pay out tax refunds during the shutdown. And at national parks, trash and human waste are piling up, causing health and safety concerns. Well, many US Democrats are saying enough is enough. They are condemning the president's tactics over getting his border wall and calling for the government to reopen.
The problem is that the government is shut down. Our state wants the government to be open for business. I think that's the most important thing for the people of Alabama right now. We have a lot of government workers in this state. We also have a lot of contractors who depend on that government work. A lot of people want border security for sure, but they also want the government services and they want the government to operate. I do not believe that holding government workers and all those affected by government services hostage is the way to determine how best to secure our borders, which everyone wants.
We can't allow this continual process that was really modernized by the Tea Party, that if I don't get what I want, if I don't get what I don't have the votes for, if I don't get what the country doesn't want, I'm just going to shut down the government. If you reward the president with that kind of tactic, Jake, then we're going to see every year the president shutting down the government, and we just can't afford to do business that way.
And for more on this, let's turn now to Stephen Erlanger in Brussels. He is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Rosemary.
So we're seeing both sides digging in with no budget compromise reached in the latest meeting. And now President Trump is threatening to declare a national emergency to get military funds for his wall. Where do you expect this to go politically? And what's it going to take to end the partial government shutdown?
Well, that's the $5 billion question. For Trump, it has become such a symbol. I mean, his campaign aides have said that they got him to think about the wall so he would remember to talk about it, to talk about immigration on the campaign trail. But now it has become a symbol of his fight for authority now that the Democrats have won one of the houses of the legislature. My guess is this would not have happened had the Republicans maintained both houses. I think there has to be a compromise. There's going to be more pressure. Federal employees are about to miss their paychecks. You heard the Alabama official talking. The Republican senators are unhappy, some of them. And Mr. Trump is trying to find some way of discussing barrier wall, fence. He's always liked steel slats. Maybe that will be a compromise. Border security is one of those funny issues that Democrats also obviously have to support border security because security is one of those issues like God and motherhood. You have to support security, but how you do it and how you spend money on it and the price for it is really up in the air. And as for an emergency, I suspect this would be unconstitutional, and it's just part of his bargaining tactic.
Right. Let's talk more about this because the shutdown, of course, is now heading into its third week. And the irony is that President Trump says he's doing this for the nation's security, but the shutdown is putting airport security at risk, with some TSA workers and air traffic controllers calling out sick because they're not getting paid and they're having to come up with other arrangements. What could this mean for the nation's security, given that is where most terrorists try to enter the United States, through the airports? And what might be the ramifications of a long-term shutdown?
Well, this is the problem. It's not just terrorism, which is pretty minor, by the way. It's illegal immigration. Most illegal immigrants are not illegal when they land in America. They have visas and they come in through airports. They don't cross the border, and they become illegal because they overstay their visas. Now, if you really wanted to crack down on illegal immigration further, and of course the government does quite a lot on this issue already, you could, work more on that. Finding people who overstayed their visas and trying to kick them out. So I think, this is politics. This is really about the White House in the face of a Democratic House trying to assert its authority and vice versa. Now, I'm sure it will come to some sort of compromise, but I cannot tell you how or when.
No, we can't find answers on that at all. We'll just have to see. But President Trump has already said publicly that this is his shutdown. So how does he gain politically by doing this? And how does he back out of this shutdown without losing face, given what has happened so far?
That's the dilemma for the White House, because his base, let's be fair, that's what it's about. It's about the 25 to 35% of voters who love Donald Trump. He's promised his base a wall. And the problem is, how do you define a wall in ways that the Democrats can accept? Now, there's a lot of fencing, walls, slats all over the border with Mexico. But it's not enough as far as Mr. Trump and his base is concerned. It's all about symbolism. So the question is, how do you find some way of acknowledging the symbolism of some kind of structure without necessarily creating impermeable barrier all across the southern United States, which frankly very few businesses want.
And of course, if this shutdown continues on for weeks, months, maybe longer, the problem is it's dangerous for the Democrats as well. I mean, both sides suffer politically, don't they?
Well, they do. And this is where, you have very experienced people on both sides, I think, trying to find ways to climb down, but without losing their political initiative. I mean, Trump says it has to be a wall or a barrier or a fence. Somehow he's gotten concrete in his brain. I don't think people care about whether it's concrete or steel. But the Democrats say, no, we care about border security. There are lots of things to do for border security without building this wall. It's the wall that has gotten into people's heads. At some point, I think there'll be a lot of political pressure, particularly on the White House, to bend, to find some way of climbing off this wall, if I could put it that way.
Right. Indeed. We'll see who blinks first, huh? Stephen Erlanger, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Rosemary.
Well, President Trump is publicly weighing in on Russia's arrest of Paul Whelan. The former US Marine was detained late last month on allegations of spying. His family insists he is innocent and that he was in Russia for a wedding. He's being held as the Kremlin protests the detention of at least 2 Russians in US custody. CNN's Sam Kiley has more now from Moscow.
Donald Trump has finally commented on the case of Paul Whelan. The former US Marine was arrested by Russian authorities on December the 28th and stands accused of espionage. The American president, when asked what he was doing about it, said, "We're looking into that, we're looking into that." Hardly the sort of aggressive stand taken, for example, by the British Foreign Secretary, because Mr. Whelan is also a British citizen, who accused the Russians of using the British citizen as a pawn in an international game of diplomacy and condemned such actions. Nonetheless, the US ambassador here has been to see Mr. Whelan in prison, and the Russian foreign minister has for now scotched suggestions that Mr. Whelan could be a pawn in a potential prisoner swap, perhaps with Russians held in the United States, because in the view of the deputy Russian foreign minister, Minister, Mr. Whelan, has not been charged with any crime, least of all espionage. That is in contradiction, of course, to what his lawyer, that's Mr. Whelan's lawyer, told CNN earlier this week when he said not only had his client been charged, but also that he was asking for bail for Mr. Whelan. Nonetheless, this all is getting increasingly murky following the arrest by American authorities of a Russian, Dmitry Makarenko, on charges that he was involved in money laundering and arms shipments based on a warrant issued for his arrest in Florida. He was picked up in U.S. territories in the North Pacific the day after Mr. Whelan was arrested. Sam Kiley, CNN, Moscow.
Well, the U.S. National Security Advisor is trying to reassure U.S. allies on the troop withdrawal from Syria. John Bolton was in Jerusalem Sunday and met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He says the U.S. withdrawal depends on certain conditions. They reportedly include protecting Kurdish allies from America's other ally, Turkey. More now with our CNN's Ian Lee in Jerusalem.
U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton is in the region to reassure allies after President Trump announced the abrupt plan to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. There was shock and concern after the announcement about who would fill the vacuum left by the United States. The feeling now is that the pullout will be more deliberate and conditional. Speaking alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here in Jerusalem, Bolton reaffirmed the United States' commitment to Israel and to the Syrian Kurds who fought alongside U.S. troops against ISIS.
Right on your border, we have the problem of the conflict in Syria. We're going to be discussing the president's decision to withdraw, but to do so from northeast Syria in a way that makes sure that ISIS is defeated and is not able to revive itself and become a threat again, and to make sure that the defense of Israel and our other friends in the region is absolutely assured, and to take care of those who have fought with us against ISIS and other terrorist groups.
The two men also discussed what Netanyahu believes is the main threat to Israel's security, and that's Iran. Bolton said despite getting out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposing sanctions, that there's little doubt Iran's leadership is still committed to achieving a deliverable nuclear device. He added the U.S. and Israel will make sure that doesn't happen. Israel and America, though, are alone here. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China, the other signatories to the Iran nuclear deal, have all refused to follow the United States' lead. And despite Israel and the United States' certainty, international monitors inside Iran have said there's no evidence Iran is currently working toward a nuclear weapon. Ian Lee, CNN, Jerusalem.
We'll take a short break here. Still to come, the world's top two economists. Does Trump have the power to do this specifically?
To build a wall, the answer is no, not directly. He can do some things and he can move some money around, but he won't be able to move $5 billion worth to actually build the wall that he seems to envision. So there are some limitations that Congress has put into effect in previous administrations. There are also some aspects of the way in which the appropriations process works in the United States. And what it really means is that the funds that are set for certain things are earmarked for those things. They can't be used normally for anything else. So there will be some challenges for the president to do what he wants to do. He has limited authority to do some things, but he has no overarching authority to actually build the wall on his own without congressional approval.
Right, so you mentioned that process. What is involved here when a US president wants to do something like this, get money from the Pentagon to build a border wall in this country, and would this be deemed a national emergency at all?
Well, under normal circumstances, it would not be a national emergency. There is no threat of invasion, in the strictest sense of that term. There is no threat of an armed force coming against the United States. If that were the case, the president would then definitely have the authority to do whatever he deemed necessary as the commander-in-chief to actually shore up the defenses along the southern border. But what we're dealing with here is in some ways a game of semantics. The real answer answer is that we don't have that kind of an invasion. What is involved in a process like this is you have to get congressional approval to move money from one area to another area.
Sources have continuously suggested that first
to the other. And the other thing that's involved here is that within the Department of Defense budgets, there are certainly funds that are earmarked for construction, but those construction funds are for military bases, potentially for the Army Corps of Engineers to do certain things that do impact the civilian sector, but these are not the kinds of things that would be allowed to be transferred to construct a border wall.
Right. So how will the Pentagon likely respond to this, to the president asking for this, and who might stand in Mr. Trump's way?
Well, this gets to be a very interesting question. Technically, if Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense Mattis were still in charge, it would be him. Given the fact that the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Mr. Patrick Shanahan, is actually serving as the acting Secretary of Defense right now, he would normally be the person to do that. But I think the real answer would be that Congress would stand in the way. They would prevent the movement of funds from one pot of money to the other pot of money. And that would, in essence, prevent, or at least has the potential of preventing the president from exercising any authorities that he may think he has to build a southern border wall.
A quick question to you. Do you believe a border wall is necessary to secure this country?
No. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the type of geography that the southern border has, and I've been on the southern border, particularly in the state of Texas, you look at some of the areas that we have, the Rio Grande River really comprises almost the entire border of Mexico and Texas. And that particular border is generally is informed by a natural barrier. There are also areas such as the Big Bend National Park where not only would it be ecologically damaging to put a fence, but from a security perspective, the fence would serve no real purpose. What would be necessary is some kind of increased monitoring through various technical means to include things like facial recognition technologies, better monitoring of who is actually stepping into the United States from Mexico, things of that nature. And that can be done through technical means. A border wall is not necessary for the entire frontage that we have with Mexico, the entire frontier with Mexico. And that, that is, I think, really what is getting lost in the debate here at this point.
Thank you, sir, for being with us. We do appreciate it.
Absolutely, Rosemary. Always a pleasure.